All right, welcome back to another tutorial in Maya. Today we're going to take a look at joints and sort of how they influence a rig, or, sort of what joints do in terms of overall rigging. As you can see here, I have a rig that I downloaded from Creative Crash and just sort of opened it up and I'm taking a look at it. So here's kind of what it looks like, and I just wanted to show you this, not because we're going to be making this rig today or doing anything remotely like this, but I just want you to kind of see, kind of what a rig is and how it operates and how it's set up. And in the outliner over here, you can see where there's a ton of stuff. I mean, this little rig obviously has some complexity to it because you're going to have some, a turret that swings around in like a 360-degree kind of motion up here. You have some various motion going on with the gun here. You have like a lot of motion that's going to go along with the feet. And just a lot of things to look at. So anyway, this is a good rig to kind of open up and take a look at, just to see what's under the hood and kind of to see what rigging, what is involved with really good rigging. Now, I'll show you where to download this in a little bit from Creative Crash, but let's sort of take a look in the outliner over here. You can see where there's a ton of stuff. There's a basic object with all of these parented underneath this object, and these are mainly the surfaces, and you'll notice a lot of orient constraints and some point constraints and some parent constraints and all sorts of stuff. So don't worry about how complex this is, because it's logical at a certain point. I just want you to see kind of what this all looks like. And in terms of the joints or the skeleton overall, there is a main skeleton node here called joint 23. And if I were to move this render view out of the way, you will see I'm in X-ray mode, and here's kind of what this rig looks like in terms of joints. And you can see where there's a very specific joint chain working here. And that's where I'm at right here. If I switch to maybe joint 24, you could see where this one sort of represents the hips joint, or the overall joint that's going to control this rig. And if I click on joint 24, here's like the hips override, or just for independent hips. And then along the way, you can just sort of click on these and kind of see how the layout of these is working. And it's a good thing to open up a rig like this and really take a look and see kind of where everything is at and what things are going on. And that kind of gives you a better idea of what's involved in rigging. All right. So anyway, I'm going to go over here. We'll take off our X-ray mode. And a good rig has some controls that you can do some various things with. And you can see where in this rig, they've included, the control curves and things, so that you kind of know what's what. You can sort of move your rig up or down. You have independent control of lots of stuff. If I click on this one over here, I can probably move this up or down, maybe backward or forward. So there's a lot of things to look at here. But in terms of animating and in terms of building a rig, you'd never probably want a lot of these in there. If I were to say lift up on this control curve and sort of bring it up, you can see where the gun penetrates the surface right there. And technically it's not that the rig was set up wrong. It's just that afterwards the modelers may need a little bit more freedom of movement and things like that. So normally you would put a joint constraint there, or something or a point constraint to sort of constrain that motion. And that's what's involved in that. But in this case, it's okay for now, because that can always be fixed a little bit later if needed. So just something to be aware of. As well, the overall rig may need some limitations. If I click on our overall point rig, or our overall control, you can see where you have a motion that goes all the way down like this, but then the geometry all folds in on itself and things. So anyway, there's going to be logical things that go on with rigs that you would sort of want to be aware of and fix. As I'm moving this up and down, You can see where, because of the leg positioning, it's sort of, doing some strange stuff there. And that may or may not be relative to the rig, but if I were to choose, let me choose this again. Let's see what we got there. Yeah, see, there's some real strangeness going on there. So anyway, obviously this would not be a working prototype, but it actually is a working rig, and it's up to the animator to sort of assign values to all the rotation of the joints and putting in constraints and whatnot. Okay, so anyway, that's just a quick thing to go do, is to maybe download a rig, and there's a ton of them over on Creative Crash, and I'm going to show you where those are at. As always, go over and see Lester Banks, because he has great stuff. In the Maya tutorials section, you'll find a tutorial that I did before this one called Getting Started with Joints and Smooth Skin Bind, and that just sort of gives you an idea of creating joints and what's involved in that. And then if you go over to Creative Crash, there's a file on page like 9 or 10, and it's called Mechanic, and it's a rig. It's called Mechanic. And so go to your Maya sections, character rigs, and there's a whole bunch of rigs in here, so feel free to take a look at any of these. Some rigs are going to work. You're always going to have some oddities. It's not like everything is going to work or be perfect for you in these, but they're uploaded by guys who kind of did these and want some feedback and whatnot, so go over there and check those out. Okay, so let's get on with it. I think what we'll do is I'm going to sort of just go to, let's open up a new scene. I sort of prepared a scene here for you. Let's get in there. All right, I'm going to go back into my general mode here for a minute. And I think what I'll do is go on to our perspective cam. We'll switch to cam 1, and I'm going to go back to the beginning here, and we'll take a look at some of this stuff. What I've done here in this exercise is just sort of laid out some text just to keep me kind of knowing what I'm doing, right? So create yourself some text, and this is something that you should do for yourself because it's really cool. You can learn a lot, all right? Is just create some text with some various things that have to do with the joint tool, like the orientation and the world axes. And I'm going to kind of show you how I came to doing some of this stuff. This right here is an IK rig, and we're going to import one of those, and we're going to play around with it. So anyway, let's take a look at this a little more closely so we can understand a little bit about pole vectors and world axes and the orientation of the joints and all of that. And it's really cool. So let's get started. I'll go back here, and I think I'm just going to go back to my perspective view. And I'll go back here and we'll sort of look at this. I have some models imported here, and I've pre-made some joints. And in this case, I just did this exercise here where these joints that I created in joint chains are based on the orientation being X, Y, Z, and the world axis of positive Y. Over here, this set back here is orientation X, Y, Z, world axis minus Y. And these over here are orientation of none and world axis to positive Y. All right, so let's take a look at some of these real quick. But before we do that, let's take a look at the skeleton IK right here. I'm going to go ahead and select this skeleton. And this skeleton was essentially one that I imported. And I'm going to show you how to do this because I know you know how to create text and you'll know how to create these joints. But in this case, I got this skeleton example by simply going up here, and I'm going to go back into the home mode. If you go to your, make sure you're in your animation menu set, first of all, and come over to skeleton, and we're going to go down to the full body IK and look for get FBIK example. And I'm going to click on that, and it'll bring up your visor. You'll notice this window pop up, and we're going to look almost specifically at just the biped example for the moment. So I'm going to click on that to make sure it's highlighted, and I want to right mouse click and import that file. Okay, and I'm going to move this visor out of the way, and as you can see, there it is. We just imported a new one. And you may want to take a look in your outliner right away and notice that the name of the file is going to be Jackie Skeleton and Human IK are the two new nodes that you got. All right, so you could either rename these or do something with them, but just be aware that they both kind of work together. So I'm going to select both of those together. And I think what I'll do is just go to the Move tool and kind of move that out and over here. And let's see, I'll hit my F key to focus on that for a second. And let's see, I think I'll just choose the skeleton to begin with, because what we want to do in this exercise is take a look at what would be a good example of a biped. And this is sort of the stock biped that's supplied within Maya. And in this case, I'm not going to be using the Human IK for the moment. So what I'll do is with that, I'll just go to Display, hide that selection. And that way I can just look at this skeleton in general. And so if I click on Jackie's skeleton right here, and I might want to give this a unique name, like, I might want to name this Bert and then Bert Skeleton or something like that. I don't know. And then we'll go to Human IK down here and go to maybe Bert, IK or something. All right, I just want to give those kind of two distinct names so I know what I'm dealing with, because I have a couple of these other ones that I created earlier. So anyway, with that in mind, let's look at this skeleton. I have the skeleton selected, and there's not really that I can tell much about its orientation or what's going on, other than I'm looking at the joints here, and they all seem to be sort of, they look kind of normal. The X is pointing down in the skeleton. Now, here's where the magic happens in trying to figure out what the heck is going on with a skeleton. For the moment, let's see. Let's go in here and just sort of deselect everything. And I want to go into, say, component mode right here, because we want to look at the components. And I'm going to go ahead and check my question mark button there. And I want to click on the hips joint right there, because I know that the hips joint generally activates the entire joint chain for a skeleton, and that's what it looks like. Okay, so if you were to just say do this, import this skeleton, you're going to notice that it has all of the joints. This tells us how their axes are oriented in space, and you can see where there's lots of little hand joints and things going on up here. All right. So we're in component mode, and we got this little question mark on so we can tell what's happening. Well, if I want to maybe just sort of isolate a certain select element of this joint chain, I could sort of click off everything and maybe just click on this arm, for example. Okay, and that's going to tell me that here's the joints, how they're configured for the arm. And in order to make things a little easier, I took this whole skeleton and I actually just hid some of these joints in the fingers so it would be less confusing. So I think I'll work with that one now. So just be aware that you can open up this whole biped example and go into component mode, put your question mark on, and see kind of how one is made. Now I'm gonna delete this one because I don't want it to be confusing everything else that I do. So I'm going to choose both of those over here and just hit delete and get rid of them. And I'm going to come down here into this one and we'll take a look at that. Let's get up in here, kind of see what's happening with this Human IK. And as a Human IK example, it's fairly well done. There will be some slight differences along the way as far as orienting joints, but in terms of what a Human IK looks like, this is what it should be looking like. So with that in mind, let's look at the feet first. You can see where the y-axis is heading up in the positive y, and the x-axis, normally with joints, the x-axis follows the bone. So it goes from your bone structure here, and it comes down, and it follows your bones in the pattern that the bones are set up in. We'll also be able to see that really well in the spinal column here. So in the spine, because the joints are going upward, you'll see that that x-axis is going upward. But you'll also notice that these y-axes are sort of going all over the place. Some are going this way, some are going straight up and down. some are in front, some are in back. And if you can imagine yourself putting your arms out at arm's length, okay, and then, just rotate just your arms, rotate them all the way around so your palms are facing up, and then go back the other way 180 degrees until your palms are, or 360 degrees until your palms are facing straight up. So you have a lot of motion with your arms. And, that is what is going on with sort of joint orientation, that in world space, Maya and the solvers recognize the y-axis as being something that would traditionally point upward in the positive direction, if that's how you set them up. And in this case, that's how this is set up. But you'll notice that even though these are in weird spaces, imagine if this model were laying down. And we go ahead and check on this over here. I sort of rotated this model so that it would be laying down. Well, now you can see where the knees are pointing straight up in Y, and that the back is sort of pointing down. And, that's just a way. I'm going to go ahead and shift click on this one over here on the hips joint. And now I can kind of see what's going on with both of those. So really, the Y is telling Maya how to sort of view this overall bone structure or this joint orientation. And, if it was in a car sitting down, the tops of the feet normally would be pointing straight up. And this just sort of mimics the 3D space. It sort of is a way of telling Maya, hey, I am a joint and I am supposed to be pointing straight up and down, unless, of course, I am rotated, and then the joint should be facing, in a different way. And that has more to do with world space. So, in terms of that world space, it's a little complicated, but not really. You have a couple of different options. Usually there's the orientation, which is, your basic joint orientation, and your world axis, which is positive Y. For the most part, with bipeds and most things that you're going to model in a real world where you're just standing on a flat plane, you're going to be in positive Y. And the joint orientation for bipeds is normally XYZ. So with that in mind, let's take a look at just a simple concept of what's known as pole vector. And it has to deal with rotation and things like that. And the pole vector, this is like, say, a joint. And let's just say that we're, let's see, I'll choose that one. I think I'll go back into my object mode here for a moment. And I'm going to click on this pole vector right here. Well, even though this object exists in 3D space, and that's how it's created, we want to, because it's in world space, we're not really rotating it in world space. In this case, I'm going to click on this right here and imagine this is like a hinge. Well, my pole vector is, the angle, or the angle that this pole is facing. But if I were to rotate that, then my pole vector for Y is now pointing in a completely different direction. It's along the Y-axis. But in world space, Maya still recognizes this object as being an object, and that the differences to calculate are, what's going on in the local realm, so to speak. Okay? So just a simple concept to kind of understand, and no big deal. So anyway, let's take a look at a couple of other things now with creating some joints. I'm going to show you what I set up over here, and we'll go from there. I'm going to go back into component mode, and I'll check my question mark there, and I'm going to hope that I can shift select all of these, which I can, and I'm going to also shift select these over here. And the difference that in creating these joints was that when I had my joint tool up, and you can do this for yourself as well, come into your skeleton and go to your joint tool and go ahead and click on your options there, and you'll have these degrees of freedom. I'm usually leaving these at XYZ for the moment on default. And if you reset your tool, go ahead and reset your tool, you'll notice a couple of things. The standard default settings are XYZ, orientation of XYZ, positive Y, which is kind of what we're looking at here. As well, if this is your first tutorial in joints, you want to look at this and set this. This is sort of important in a way, is to, first we want to not scale compensate. We want to uncheck that almost always, just because that, if we're trying to scale things in other programs or bring this back and forth, this skeleton back and forth between various programs, scale compensate can kind of really mess you up. So I like to leave that unchecked. Another thing you want to look at, short bone length, is set at 1. Well, we have a short bone radius of 0.5. Our long bone, we may want to also set up to sort of the same parameters there, just to keep things kind of consistent within Maya. So with my long bone length, I want to set it up to the same as my short bone length, which is a length of 1. And my long bone radius, I want this to be at 0.500 to match what's in my short bone radius there. Okay? So with that in mind, that is how a good starting setup for your joint settings should be. So I'm going to go ahead and click off of there for a second, and we'll take a look at these joints. These were created in XYZ positive Y. You can see where the positive Y is sort of going straight up, and that the rest of the joints are sort of in the same orientation as a normal object when you would create it in X, Y, and Z. So we have our X and our Y and our Z. And in this case, you can see where the joint chain itself, X, is sort of mimicking the path of where these joints are, because that's what joint orientation for X should always be. And in this case, same thing here. I built it from bottom up, and in the top view, XYZ is going to place them in an XYZ positive like that. So that's a good setup. But you'll notice that if you have XYZ and you have a Y set to a negative, the basic vector, or that Y value, or the Y axis, is pointing down into negative Y space. And there will be reasons along the way where you would want to switch that to a negative, but for the most part, we're just sort of looking at our logical skeleton the way that it should be. And so that's a negative Y. And if you want to look at, say, the orientation, where most of the time leg joints are created with your orientation set to none, just as a default setting to begin with. But I'll go ahead and click on these here for a second, and we'll activate all of these. And go from the bottom of the chain there. And you can see where you have XYZ, orientation is set to none. So essentially it's just defaulting to an XYZ format, but in the positive Y. But orientation is set to none, which means that in some of these cases, X, which normally should be following along the joint chain, is not. It's just sort of out here in the middle of nowhere, so it has no orientation in that X value, because the orientation is set to none. We're not really telling it X, Y, or Z, so it basically just defaults and sets it to the normal standard Maya X, Y, Z. All right, so that's sort of something to keep in mind. Now, if we take a look at sort of joint chains in terms of creating them, here I have some simple joint chains that I created, and I haven't assigned any orientation to these, but we're going to take a look at sort of some steps along the way. These are just some basic joints that I created, and they have no orientation basically, and so that was the starting point. Well, when I went to orient those joints, or actually I parented these joints to a hip in order to sort of give Maya and the bone structure a little more information as to how to orient these. So this is the same thing as this. It's just that I parented this joint to the hip joint to there, and got these extra two joints. And what I did on this third example is I went ahead and oriented this joint. So I basically chose this joint system, and I'm going to keep this one active as well. But I chose this one, and if you go to skeleton, orient joint, and go ahead and click on your options there, this will now give you options to sort of reset your orientation. So in this case, I reset the orientation to, X, Y, Z with positive Y axis. And I left these sort of both checked here. So essentially, if you hit orient, that will orient a whole joint chain. And there it is. So you can see where it did the proper thing with the X. By orienting it, it took this X and it put that along the joint chain where it should be. So that's cool. All right, and likewise, I made a spine and sort of did the same thing for this chain. It was unoriented to begin with, although these that I created in the side view going in a straight line oriented themselves, because that was just the creation method that I used. So I'm going to go ahead and shift select the middle of this one, and there's the orientation. So everything looks pretty correct. Now, one thing that you'll notice on the last joint, almost always the last joint on every joint chain is sort of not really set. You'll see where this joint chain is set to not really XYZ, because this X, let's look at this a little closer. This X, normally if you look at the ankle into the foot, this X joint should be pointing this way, but you're not going to be animating the end joint most of the time. So this little joint that always shows up at the end of a joint chain, almost always these are you don't have to worry about anything that's going on with that necessarily. Okay, so there it is. All right, so what I want you to do is set yourself up some of these examples, and I'll show you how to do that real quickly. And then in the next tutorial, we'll go on to the single IK chains, or single IK chain, and we'll set up some IK chains and stuff to make things kind of move around and get control of those joints. So anyway, I'm going to go here to File. I think I'll go ahead and save this scene, and we'll just hit Continue. I'm going to open a new scene. So we'll go to File, Open Scene. Oh, no, actually, I'll just do a new scene. File, New Scene. Okay, there we go. And a lot of times when you're creating joints and using the joint tool, just go ahead and click into your foreview. Most of the time you're going to be using your front, side, and top views, and more so just your side view and your top view. So I like the side view, so I'm going to click on the side view here, and I'm going to set up just some simple leg joints and the spine joint and show you how to use that spine tool. So go ahead and select Skeleton, go to your joint tool, and click on your options. Right now, if you just go, I already reset these, so I want to keep this consistent right in here. And the orientation, XYZ, positive Y. Well, we're going to create the legs, and so you really always want to be aware of what's happening over here. So as far as the leg joints go, I'm just going to go ahead and set that to none to begin with, and I'll leave this at positive Y. And I'm going to go ahead and just click in here. I'll click up here to make like the top of the leg. By the hips, there's the knee. Here's like the ankle, and then I'll click down here once, and that'll start the foot. And then I'm going to shift and click, and that'll give me a nice straight joint for that toe. And I'll hit enter on the keyboard, and that establishes the joint chain. Likewise, what I'll do is I might as well do a spine. And in this case, the spinal column, you could leave no orientation on, but I'd prefer to maybe make it in the XYZ. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Y on the keyboard. That brings up your joint tool again. And I'm going to change the orientation to X, Y, and Z. All right. And I'll go ahead and just click in this window once down here, and I'll just sort of make a pseudo joint chain working my way up instead of down. And you can see where that switches the direction of the way the joints want to flow. So I'll go ahead and hit return, and let's say that that's my spine. That's cool. All right. So now in the same instance here, I think what I'll do is I'll go over here and go into the top view and create a sort of straight across arm type joint chain for like one side. So I'll go ahead and hit Y on the keyboard again, and I'm going to leave this orientation the same, like XYZ plus Y. And I'm just going to shift, I'm going to push down on I'm going to select the first joint, or click to make the first joint, and then hold my shift button down, And no matter where I'm at, you can see where it'll make a straight joint depending on, where you click. I'm going to hit Edit Undo on that one, and I'm going to Shift and click straight ahead here. And you can see where it starts to get a little funky if you don't do things in a particular way. So anyway, I'll just sort of set up a joint chain that looks like that. I'm going to hit Return to sort of set that. All right, and I'm going to come back here into my top view and look at my perspective view. And in this case, I'm going to move this joint chain straight up, and there we go. So let's move it up to kind of where the arm would normally be. All right, and now let's check to see. What we'll do is go into component mode. I'm going to go over here and go to component mode and go into my question mark thingy. And I'm going to just sort of click on these. I'll shift click to select these. And now we can see our joints and how they're oriented. In this case, I don't have the right orientation on the leg necessarily because I set this leg up with a joint orientation of none. Okay? And in this case, I set the spine up with joint orientation of XYZ, and that's what I got there. And also the arm as well. So the arm is what you would expect. Everything is in the Y positive, and the X is all along the X axis, and the Z is right there. So, so you notice that there is some strangeness going on here where we have an X, that this is not following along here. So what if I were to say maybe just select, I'm going to deselect some of this stuff here. Sometimes you have to go back into your object mode and come back into your joint component mode. So I'll go ahead and click on this joint and see if I can fix this along the way. I'm going to go to Skeleton Orient Joint, and I'm going to go ahead and click on my Orient joint and see if I can fix this. It may or may not. So I hit Orient, and it didn't necessarily fix that, but this is something that you would probably come in and start rearranging manually if there's a problem like that. Okay, we're not going to do that at the moment. Right now, what I want you to do is go and set up one of those exercises with these joints like this, and sort of play around with that, and just really get a good idea about how that joint orientation works and going into component mode. Okay, so that's it for this tutorial. Have a good time with it. Just sort of think about it. Of course, read a book, get the owner's manual, Autodesk owner's manual, and yeah, be a good person to everybody all day, every day, 365 days a year. Okay, thanks for watching.